Follow the Money, How China Bought the World, written by Michael William McCarthy, narrated by Russell Newton. Chapter 1. Kinmen Island, Taiwan. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in a society, they create for themselves, in the course of time, a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. Frederick Bastiat. Kinmen Island, off the Chinese mainland, is a tourist attraction of a very different kind. Formerly known as Quemoy, there are no museums, beaches, hip restaurants, nightclubs, ancient ruins, or that sort of typical tourist attraction. The island is known for its tunnels. Actually, Kinmen is neither famous nor exciting, but it should be. After you read this book and tell all your friends, it may well be. Kinmen has a fascinating past and an important future. It was on the cutting edge of the Cold War, and if or when the CCP attempts to invade Taiwan again, it may be the place where World War III erupts. For reasons best known to itself, Kinmen belongs to Taiwan, but the island is no more than a hop, skip, and jump from mainland China. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended with the victory of the Communist People's Republic of China, PRC. The government of the Republic of China, ROC, controlled by Chiang Kai-shek, and his Kuomintang, KMT followers, along with 1.3 million anti-communist citizens, fled from mainland China to Formosa, now known as Taiwan. Given the state of poverty in China after World War II, a lot of people joined the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, which formed the People's Liberation Army, PLA, and won a war against the nationalists. Following Shek in grim pursuit, in 1954, Chairman Mao started an artillery barrage from the mainland aimed at destroying the general's troops based on Kinmen. Rather than get blown to bits, the Taiwanese dug tunnels. They dug an awful lot of tunnels. They built an entire city underground, complete with streets, barracks, hospitals, schools, and even a marina. The CCP bombardment went on for years, first with artillery, and then with propaganda leaflets. The Communists only gave up the battle after the U.S. 7th Fleet showed up, and Mao's invasion attempt ended. U.S. Secretary of State Christian Herter, 1959 to 1961, later referred to the conflict as the first serious nuclear crisis. The China Quarterly, Volume 62, June 1975, pages 263 to 270, contains mention of 2 volumes of Cultural Revolution compilations by Mao Zedong. Although these documents cannot be authenticated as to accuracy of transcription and are obviously selective, they throw light on the 1958 Quemoy crisis with surprisingly frank admissions of miscalculation on Mao's part, both in terms of his objective in the bombardment and his underestimation of the American response to it. However, the distinguished British historian Margaret Macmillan believes that Mao may have concluded it was in the best interest of the PLA to leave Quemoy in the hands of the nationalists. If the PLA were to seize the islands, or the nationalists were to abandon them. Chapter 2. Lotus Land of the Pacific. He who is not contented with what he has would not be contented with what he would like to have. Socrates. You can look it up. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. One person's plum is another person's pits, or something like that. But in most top 10 lists published in travel magazines, my home of Vancouver gets top marks as one of the world's most beautiful cities. At a website called Luxury Travel Experts, Vancouver is listed as second only to Cape Town for beauty. Since I've never been to Cape Town, I cannot argue. Other cities getting top marks are Venice, Paris, Amsterdam, Prague, Hong Kong, Rio de Janeiro, San Francisco, Rome, and New York. I have visited several of those cities, and I would not necessarily call them all beautiful. I love San Francisco for its character, although I can do without its swarms of beggars. But Vancouver is the most picturesque, unless it's raining, in which case stay home. And we have enough homeless of our own, thank you very much. Today I'm playing Tourist in Your Own Town. It's a staycation. This story angle is sure to annoy some who would prefer articles about some other distant destinations. But hiding within the confines of Vancouver is a secret Asian world that few tourists or even Vancouverites know about or ever visit. Sometimes referred to as Hongcouver, the suburb of Richmond is a veritable Chinese colony with its own language and culture. Its population is 215,000, of which 107,080 people, or 54% of the city's population, at the last census, have a Chinese background, with that percentage growing annually with constant immigration. The city of Vancouver itself has a population of 499,000, of which 20% are Chinese, which is a higher percentage than the original English and Scottish colonizing population combined. Richmond, you see, represents the future. Futurist Frank Ogden, a.k.a. Dr. Tomorrow, the highest-paid speaker in the history of the National Speakers Bureau in Canada, whose biography I wrote, used to say in his speeches, 900 million Chinese are no more likely to stay in China than the Europeans stayed in Europe. He claimed this statement always caused an uproar, with some people throwing chairs and denouncing him as a racist, while he replied they didn't want to think about the future. Of all the Chinatowns in Canada or the world, there is no close comparison to Richmond, and today I am enjoying a special customized tour. My guide, Mi-Jun Peck, is a well-known Chinese media personality. She's often on TV and publishes Follow Me Foodie, an award-winning food and restaurant guide about Chinese food, and Mi-Jun knows everything about food and Richmond restaurants. If you want to dine on some of the best Chinese food in the world, it certainly pays to have an accomplished Chinese guide. For years I'd heard vague rumors about the Golden Village, sometimes known as the Golden Triangle. They don't all speak English there. The signs and menus are often in Chinese only, and the food is from a totally different culture. You need a guide. Driving through the triangle, it's impossible to see any kind of vision. Chapter 3. The City of Angels. Capitalism is the extraordinary belief that the nastiest of men, for the nastiest of motives, will somehow work together for the benefit of all. John Maynard Keynes. My journey of discovery of the new L.A. starts, of all places, at the corner of South Figueroa Street and West 9th in downtown Los Angeles. I'm staying at the Marriott Residence Inn, just across from the L.A. Live Plaza and the Staples Arena, the heart of the new downtown. Normally, whenever I'm visiting L.A. on a press trip, I stay in West Hollywood or Beverly Hills, maybe at the Hilton. In the past, nobody visiting L.A. stayed downtown because it was a dump. But I've heard rumors that good things have been happening downtown, and I want to find out more. I've made so many trips to California and written so many stories that I've lost count. Living in Vancouver, British Columbia, I've flown to the City of Angels itself dozens of times. The California Tourism Board loves me. I've explored all the U.S. West Coast, from Oregon down to Mexico, California inland to Palm Springs, the Temecula Valley, the Sierras, Highway 395 east of the Sierras. I've published so many travel articles in Canadian newspapers about California, I should be a tour guide. When I lived in Northern California for many years, I drove down to San Francisco twice a week to play hockey and have a look around. Over 7 years, I figure I've been to San Francisco at least 700 times, and I never got bored. It is the world's most interesting city. But L.A. never interested me that much. Too much sprawl, smog, and freeways. But things have changed. I wander from the Marriott up Figueroa northwards, slowly, looking around. Certainly many things seem to have changed. Lots of cars and pedestrians. The first time I came to L.A. many years ago, there wasn't even a downtown worthy of the name. Then they started putting up skyscrapers. In the land where the automobile is king, there's even a subway now. People come down to the Staples Arena via the subway for basketball, hockey, and concerts. Judging by the number of new office skyscrapers, lots of people commute to work downtown too. Who'd have thunk it? Actually, I am not in L.A. to sightsee. I'm on my way to the Marquesa Islands in the South Seas, reputed to be the most beautiful place in the world, to write articles. Writers Herman Melville, Robert Louis Stevenson, Thor Heyerdahl, French painter Paul Gauguin, and Belgian musician Jacques Brel moved to these islands looking for escape from the modern world. I can't imagine anyone coming to L.A. to find peace and quiet. I'm surprised at the hustle and bustle. Staying at the Marriott, I'm able to do what I would never have imagined doing in the past, which is to walk around downtown on foot and see what's going on, up close and firsthand. Obviously, things have changed a great deal. The Tourism Bureau folks have worked out an interesting itinerary for me. They are aware of my proposed storyline of the new L.A., and are keen to support it. The new downtown L.A. is hip, they say. Chapter 4, The South Seas. We have always known that heedless self-interest was bad morals. We now know that it is bad economics. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Tahiti. Ta-heat-e. Just the blend of sharp consonants spoken together with the tongue clicking against your teeth evokes dreams of an earthly paradise. Imagined from a distance, the Polynesian islands are a lush tropical playground to which those in a madding, modern Western world full of worry and tension aspire to visit, at least for a romantic holiday. Since its discovery a few centuries ago, Westerners have traveled to the South Seas as an escape, and sometimes in an attempt to change their lives. Famous writers and artists like Herman Melville, Robert Louis Stevenson, Jack London, Thor Heyerdahl, Belgian singer Jacques Brel, and French artist Paul Gauguin have ventured or moved to the South Seas and written about their adventures. They painted images of an exotic dreamland that, sadly, never really existed, or only existed to some small degree before the arrival of the invading colonial powers. After a very long flight from L.A., I arrived too late at Fa'a International Airport outside Papeete, the capital city of Tahiti and of the Polynesian territories, to meet my Polynesian Tourism Board guide. The plane was late leaving Los Angeles, where an overzealous teenage security guard, making minimum wage, seized both my water bottle and toothpaste. There was a dribble of water in the bottle after I had poured it out in the washroom, and my toothpaste tube, half full, was deemed to be a serious security threat. This sort of uptight, anal-retentive behavior stands in sharp contrast to my arrival at Fa'a Airport, where my guide has gotten bored waiting for me to arrive and simply left, leaving me to find my own way to town and the ferry dock. At the ferry, I revert to my very rusty high school French. Evidently, for some reason, my guide has already gone ahead to Moorea, Tahiti's sister island, and our planned destination for today. And the ferry staff say I should meet her there, even though I don't have a ticket to get there, because she has it. Whatever. I managed to explain and am let aboard. Everything in French Polynesia is French, including the language and customs. Few people speak a word of English, including the Polynesians. It soon becomes clear that Polynesia is a French colony, with all that word implies. Time is a theoretical concept. No one worries about issues like punctuality. The Polynesians are extremely relaxed, while the French prove, as I've learned elsewhere in my global travels, rude and condescending. The so-called work ethic here is non-existent. The capital city of Papeete, surprisingly, is a dump, and everything is imported and very expensive. Moorea, a short ferry ride away, is simply a suburb of Papeete, along with a couple of beach resorts. Few tourists stay on the island of Tahiti. They land at the Fa'a airport and transfer to flights to Bora Bora and other. Chapter 5, The Land of Oz. Our economy is based on spending billions to persuade people that happiness is buying things, and then insisting that the only way to have a viable economy is to make things for people to buy, so they'll have jobs and get enough money to buy things. Philip Slater. For some reason, I've always liked Australians. There are a lot of Aussies where I live in Canada, drawn by the opportunity to go skiing while on a 2-year work visa, which is allowed because both countries are part of the British Commonwealth. Aussies strike me as a cheerful people, always ready with the "no worries, mate" when faced with any problem. So when the Queensland Tourism Bureau offers me an invitation to come to the Great Barrier Reef to learn how to scuba dive, and publish a story about it, of course, I accept with full grace and humility. It's a long way from Canada to down under, and I may have mentioned that long ago I had learned the first law of journalism, which is never pay for your own drinks, can be adopted to never pay for your own global travels if you can find a way to get them for free. As explained earlier, I had already come to the sad realization that Vancouver, while a beautiful place when it is not raining, is the most overpriced city in the world if you consider the average annual income compared to the ever-rising and sky-high cost of living. So it was with great surprise that I discovered that the basic necessities of life, like pizza and beer, cost even more in Sydney than back home. Actually, Sydney is located nowhere near the Great Barrier Reef, but international flights land in Sydney, and I want to visit my friend, also named Michael, who I met while we were both in Cambodia enjoying adventures. Like the time our overloaded ferry boat almost sank in the great inland sea called the Tonle Sap, which was conveniently full of crocodiles looking for tourists to nosh on. We kindly requested that the captain jump overboard and find the hole in the hull, which turned out he had made when he smashed into the dock near Angkor Wat, and also named Michael and I had been friends ever since. Michael and his wife and son live in a small flat some distance from downtown Sydney, as close to downtown as they could afford under the circumstances. He works in the world of finance, a job where he was paid good money. His wife also had a good job, but real estate prices in Sydney were so high that they couldn't afford to live any closer to downtown. This comes as a surprise to me. Australia is on the other side of the world from Canada, and news of Oz is hard to come by, so I had no idea what the Chinese financial invasion of Australia had done to the cost of living there. While Vancouver is the first stepping stone into North America for Chinese money and immigrants, Australia is a lot closer to China, and hot Chinese money had been arriving in Sydney for several years and has made a huge impact. To celebrate my arrival, we all go out to dinner and Michael is paying. We split a pizza 4 ways and have a beer. and the damage comes to what it would cost a person in Des Moines to buy a used car. Their little flat in an ordinary neighborhood is worth $1 million Canadian dollars. He can't afford to own a car. Thanks to Chinese investment, the cost. Chapter 6. China. The Dragon Emerges. Oxford Dictionary. Communism is a political theory derived from Karl Marx, advocating class war and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Anyone who has been there knows that Hong Kong is not the real China, although the Chinese Communist Party, under the command of dictator Xi Jinping, seems determined to strip the city of the freedoms that make it different from mainland China, and so turn Hong Kong into another subservient vassal state. Anyone who has been to Hong Kong will quickly realize that the city is one of the most expensive places in the world, and therefore should arrange their hotel accommodations accordingly. On my many trips through Hong Kong, I have never enjoyed the luxury of being comped, i.e., treated to a complimentary visit by the Tourism Bureau, so unfortunately today I have to pay the freight myself, in which case I can either sleep on a bench at the airport with a suitcase locked to my wrist, or find a cheap hotel in Kowloon across the bay. The metropolitan area encompassing Hong Kong, Kowloon, Shenzhen, and Guangdong, formerly known as Canton, has a population of over 50 million people. The Mong Kok neighborhood of Kowloon boasts an extremely high population of 340,000 residents per square mile, described as the densest district in the world by Guinness Book of Records. So, online, I've booked a room in the Dragon Inn in Mong Kok. Located on the 22nd floor of an old and decrepit concrete office tower, the Dragon proves to be virtually empty as I arrive late at night after a long flight from North America. A small room with a small light bulb in a dark corridor reveals an old man reading a newspaper who hands me the key to my room without saying a word, and I shuffle down the dark corridor and along several hallways until I come to my room, which apparently has been renovated from being a broom closet into a hotel room, simply by somehow inserting a bed into the available space. I measure the room for posterity. It is 37 inches wide and 72 inches long. How anyone managed to stuff a bed into it is another mystery. But for $24 US in Hong Kong, you don't get a master bedroom with ensuite facilities and a view. In the morning, I discover that the elevator doesn't work, so I walk down 22 flights of stairs to the lobby with my bag. But the door is locked, so I descend further to the basement, which turns out to be full of parked cars, climb onto the hood of one car, and slither through a window to the outside world, where I discover approximately 5 million people commuting to work, somewhat like a rock concert without the music. Carried afloat by the masses, I manage to find the subway and make my way to the Star Ferry on the western side of Hong Kong Bay, perhaps the cheapest tourist attraction in the world, the fare of 5 cents not having increased since the ferry was first built many decades ago. I grab a seat and enjoy the fabulous view of the downtown Hong Kong skyscraper. Chapter 7. Darwin and the Theory of Evolution. We are in danger of destroying ourselves by our greed and stupidity. We cannot remain looking inwards at ourselves on a small and increasingly polluted and overcrowded planet. Stephen Hawking. The remote island of Espanola in the Galapagos is a strange place to learn about the real meaning of the phrase survival of the fittest. The plane from Guayaquil, Ecuador, lands at Puerto Baquerizo Moreno Airport on the island of San Cristobal, where passengers take a shuttle to the harbor and board a Zodiac to transfer to the MV Grace, a fancy wooden yacht. If you are going to explore the Galapagos, I would recommend a vessel like the Grace, built by billionaire Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, who gave it to Princess Grace of Monaco on the occasion of her marriage to the Prince of Monaco. The sleek luxury yacht has somehow ended up here in the far nether regions of the world to accommodate and transfer passengers from island to island in one of the most unique locations on the planet. Unlike a big cruise ship, there are only a dozen passengers and a guide, which makes all the difference when getting an education about the Galapagos wildlife, as I most certainly do. Being a travel writer from North America whose articles will be published in many Canadian newspapers, I'm offered a complimentary voyage by the Ecuadorian Tourism Bureau. This contrasts sharply with the rather large sums of money forked out by the other paying customers to enjoy a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. But to balance the books, I am given a berth in the bottom of the boat with only a porthole for a view. As it surprisingly turns out, there are 3 decks on the yacht, and the higher up the berth, the more subject that berth is to wave action, so the honeymooners on the top deck get pitched around like softballs every night. The second surprise is that the yacht transfers between islands at night, so you need to be roped into your berth as you sleep in order to avoid being tossed onto the floor. The third and far more pleasant surprise is discovered over breakfast the next morning, as naturalist and guide Rafael Pesantes, a world-class ornithologist, explains the rules of the game. It takes 6 generations for the fear gene to grow within the animal brain. The animals on the Galapagos, except for the giant tortoises on the main island of Santa Cruz that were captured by whaling crews for food on long ocean journeys, have never been attacked or exploited by human beings. Therefore, the birds and marine mammals are not afraid of tourists, no matter how badly dressed we may be. The islands belong to them. We are merely short-term looky-loos. Under no circumstances whatsoever, says Raphael, are we to harass the wildlife or step off the path. Look, take photos, but do not approach. Likely all the creatures we meet will simply ignore our intrusion, he says, but watch out for the alpha male sea lions on the beach that will protect their harems. The news about the animals being tame, which is not... Chapter 8. Finding the Meaning of Life in Jamaica. Greed is not a financial issue, it's a heart issue. Andy Stanley. What is the meaning of life? Wikipedia may be the worst possible place to look for answers, but if you Google that question, their reply comes at the top of the page, so a lot of people must look to Wikipedia for answers. Their definition, as always, is opaque and doesn't really provide any clear answers. The meaning of life, as we perceive it, is derived from philosophical and religious contemplation of, and scientific inquiries about, existence, social ties, consciousness, and happiness. Many other issues are also involved, such as symbolic meaning, ontology, value, purpose, ethics, good and evil, free will, the existence of one or multiple gods, conceptions of God, the soul, and the afterlife. Does that help clear the picture? No? Googling many other articles and definitions results in one common denominator, which is having a meaningful existence. I think there's a great deal of truth in that statement. After all, if your life is pointless, what's the point? Just throw a stick for dogs to fetch and see how happy they become. Fetching the stick serves a purpose, For many dogs, it is ingrained in their genetic makeup, although I don't know the value of Shih Tzu lap dogs. People are much the same, although I suggest throwing a stick for many to fetch won't do the trick. In fact, if you ask most people about the meaning of life, they will look at you as if you are Shih Tzu. I think the best place to find the meaning of life is at a school, which is why I went to the elementary school in Ocho Rios in Jamaica. I'd wrangled a free trip to Jamaica simply by contacting Sandals Resorts and explaining to them that the hottest new travel trend is meaningful travel, and they should get in on the action. I suspect the most popular and profitable travel trend in North America remains flying to Cancun and getting drunk on the beach. But since I have no interest in that sort of experience, I refrained from mentioning it. Why? I said to the Sandals PR department. I would be so kind as to stay at their resort for free and subject myself to a week of exploration of the meaningful trips that were possible in the vicinity of their resort, skipping the usual beach life and golf, and write a story for Canadian newspapers whose readers are so desperate for a sunshine story in the middle of winter, they will tolerate a travel story with meaning, as long as there's a photo of a place that looks warm. Actually, I stole the story idea after coming across an organization called Pack for a Purpose, which suggests that bringing appropriate gifts, like school supplies, to developing countries makes both the giver and receiver happy. The PR department had done their homework and agreed to my theory. So, Bob's your uncle, and I snagged a free trip to Jamaica. Actually, you would have to read the Sandals Ocho Rios web. Chapter 9. The Latest Blitz of London. We cannot negotiate with people who say, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable. John F. Kennedy. Finding a Chinese presence in London, England, is a challenging task. I thought Toronto was the most multicultural city in the world, until I arrived in London. Strolling down the streets, there appears to be a face from every race in the world, which I am told was a factor in England's irrational decision to pull out of the European Union via Brexit. Too many foreigners, brayed the elderly pensioners, sipping on their tea and nibbling on scones while turning up their noses. Indeed, there are Indians, Muslims, Africans, and even pink people, but the Chinese are not much in attendance, visually. Although beneath the surface, they are making their mark in real estate, as always. We start our strolling just south of the Thames River, where a grotesque monstrosity named the Shard has been erected. A glass and steel skyscraper like those found in most cities, this one looking rather unfinished due to its jagged rooftop. My wife is on a mission to visit every museum in the world, and since half of them are in London, she is in heaven. I follow dutifully with an eye more on the architecture than on museums. We visit the Tate, the London Museum, the Royal Whatever, and the Sir John Soames House-turned-museum, easily my favorite, because you half expect Dumbledore or Harry Potter to appear out of the cobwebs. Sir John was an architect, collector, and certified nut bar, as his collection of bric-a-brac, paintings, sculpture, architectural fragments, models, books, drawings, and furniture prove. I didn't find out if he actually purchased his pieces or merely borrowed them, as was the British colonial habit at the time. All the major museums in London seem to exhibit ancient artifacts casually taken from Greece, Italy, and the Middle East, and not returned. Yet. Chinese investment in London commercial property has more than trebled since Britain voted to leave the EU, most of the loot channeled through Hong Kong at a time of heightened political uncertainty in the former British colony. Investors, largely from Hong Kong, are snapping up British capital's best-known skyscrapers, including the Cheese Grater and the Walkie-Talkie. Recently, Chinese investors spent £3.96 billion on London commercial property, according to data from the CBRE Real Estate Group, the highest amount on record, and outpacing the £2.69 billion spent in the previous year. Hong Kong accounted for 92% of the Chinese investment, according to the Knight Frank agency. Hong Kong food conglomerate Lee Kum Kee paid £1.28 billion for 20 Fenchurch Street, the 34-story skyscraper known as the Walkie-Talkie, a record for an office building in Britain. With Beijing cracking down on foreign deals by mainland companies, investors there are using Hong Kong as... Chapter 10. The Grand Tour of Switzerland. Ayn Rand's philosophy is nearly perfect in its immortality, which makes the size of her audience all the more ominous and symptomatic as we enter a curious new phase in our society. To justify and extol human greed and egotism is, to my mind, not only immoral, but evil. Gore Vidal. On August 4th, 1845, in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, a British entrepreneur named Thomas Cook arranged accommodations for a party of rich folks to travel by rail from Leicester to Liverpool. It was a success. Following that, in 1847, Cook launched Grand Tours of Europe for the newly rich British industrialists to travel to Switzerland and enjoy the unpolluted air in the mountains. Such were the humble beginnings of what has since become known as the tourism industry, now one of the world's largest businesses. That same Grand Tour of Switzerland, 150 years ago, is still available for selection for those travelers who know where to go. The kind folks at Swiss Tourism, using search engine optimization, noticed my byline appearing in many newspaper articles all across Canada. I was invited to watch a webinar on my computer about their country, and, subsequently, invited to invent a storyline that would interest as many Canadian newspaper readers as possible. I decided that recreating a Thomas Cook Grand Tour would be the way to go. History, Swiss tradition, the kind folks at Swiss Tourism agree, and to pay the freight. Whereas Cook's tours went slowly by boat and carriage, today the modern traveler flies directly to Zurich, a global banking center. Centered around the Limmat River, the town reflects the old Grand Tour glory with its cobblestone streets, tall church spires, and bustling cafes along the river. I'm invited to take my accommodation at the glorious Widder Hotel, originally built in the 12th century as a warehouse. Today, the Widder is the epitome of classic Swiss service and charm, its original stone walls of 1192 standing in sharp contrast with the hotel's modern plasma TVs and see-through glass elevators. I have a secret card that I do not divulge to my hosts. Also named Michael lives now in Zurich, and I'm invited to stay with him for a week before beginning my grand tour. We explore the city, and I learn its history. For instance, Bahnhofstrasse is Zurich's main downtown street, and one of the world's most expensive and exclusive shopping avenues. In 2011, a study named the Bahnhofstrasse the most expensive street for retail property in all of Europe and perhaps the world. Over the years, the street has managed to attract the crème de la crème of the world's business community, Its most famous jewelers, watch and clock firms, hoteliers, and bankers, and the clamor for space on the street has been so insistent that the price of land has soared to double that of Fifth Avenue rate in New York. Chapter 11. Montreal and the Prairies. The more material things that we possess, the less clear life becomes. Therefore, if you want clarity, have a garage sale. Craig D. Lounsbrough. It seems the French and English have not gotten along well over the centuries, each nation invading the other as the opportunity arose. That enmity in Europe may no longer be as profound, but in North America it is different, or at least it was when I was born in Quebec. Montreal was in the middle of unprecedented cultural change in the late 60s, with French-speaking separatists engaging in violence and forcing the departure of much of the English-speaking minority. As an Anglo myself, I went looking for work elsewhere and thankfully ended up in Vancouver in 1971. The population of Vancouver has since doubled, and the population of Toronto has tripled, but Montreal has lagged behind the national average growth rate for many reasons. Immigrants to Canada would rather live elsewhere. However, by 2030, the greater Montreal area is expected to grow to 5.275 million, of which 1.72 million will belong to a visible minority group. One wonders how many of that minority will be Chinese. It has been 50 years since I was last in Montreal, and while much has changed, the overall appearance of the city has not. Unlike Vancouver, there isn't a veritable wall of brand-new glass towers cascading all over the landscape. I note the little wooden house where I was born in the suburb of Saint-Lambert, at one time a white clapboard cottage, is now restored and has a heritage designation. Google Maps show many houses in the little town now possess backyard swimming pools, a sure sign of affluence. Property values are increasing. While Canada remains a perennially popular destination for investment from China, shifting dynamics in Canada's national real estate market, brought about by economic and political forces, are seeing investors broaden their horizons. For many years, the story of Chinese real estate investment in Canada was a tale of only two cities, specifically Vancouver and Toronto. While those two major Canadian markets remain buoyant, various trends have forced Chinese investors to diversify their holdings, with Montreal very much in vogue, notes a 2020 report from Zhuai.com, the Chinese real estate evaluator. Canada's second-largest city also took the number 3 spot in volume of buyer inquiries, followed by Calgary, Ottawa, Belleville, Markham, Hamilton, and Victoria rounding out the list. In fact, Chinese investment in Canada is also spreading across the prairies. With too few farms in China to feed a burgeoning population, Chinese immigrants have started buying up agricultural lands in Canada and shipping their produce to Asia. According to Fox News, with new overseas investment comes fears that a generation of young Canadian would-be farmers are being squeezed out of the market by newcomers that... Chapter 12. California and the States. Capitalism is a social system owned by the capitalistic class, a small network of very wealthy and powerful businessmen who compromise the health and security of the general population for corporate gain. Susie Kassem. It's been a few years since I was last in California. My family and I used to live in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. Marin is widely regarded as one of the best places to live in all of the excited states. High income, highly educated. There are a few dozen villages and one town scattered among rolling hills between San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean. The hippies discovered Marin way back in the 60s and did their best to stop real estate developers from wrecking the place and turning it into ticky-tacky suburbs. They did a good job. Musicians, cultural creatives, software experts, and conservationists all did so well to preserve the character of the county that it subsequently turned into some of the most expensive real estate in the country. Back then, as a Canadian living with a wife who had an American passport, I was somewhat limited in what kind of work I could do. So I wrote a feature story about real estate in the new village where we had moved and submitted it to the editor of the local news magazine, the prestigious Pacific Sun, an alternative weekly that had been published since the mid-60s. The story was purchased and published immediately, and the editor wanted to know who the hell I was. Only a month as a resident of the county and immediately an expert on housing? I explained I'd been writing similar features in Vancouver newspapers. I said, NIMBYism is everywhere, which is why it is so hard to get anything built in Marin. The conservationists had made it too difficult to build anything new for the past few decades, so the county was full of elderly widows living in 4-bedroom houses, because no one had been able to build any senior citizen retirement homes because of stringent development rules. I was hired by the Sun as a freelancer and spent much of my time for the next several years riding my mountain bike around the hills, searching for waterfalls and picnic locations, and then writing books about the secret places I discovered. Also, a couple of feature stories a month for the front cover were required. A tough assignment, but somebody has to do the hard jobs. When not working my fingers to the bone, I commuted to San Francisco twice a week to play hockey. As a writer, I don't do math, but I estimated in 7 years, I made 700 trips to San Francisco, and after every game, I parked my car in a new neighborhood and explored. I think I know the city better than anyone who lives there. The Mission District, where all the poor people and Latinos lived, was my favorite. Thanks to Google, rents there have quadrupled since I left. All the young techies working in Silicon Valley don't want to live in the valley, or can't afford homes there. Many creative people from the Mission have been forced out and have moved to a neighborhood south of the Mission called Dog Patch, which is now getting yuppified. I visit Dog Patch on this trip and write about it as well. Today, I'm making yet another exploration. Chapter 13, Tibet and India. Earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed. Mahatma Gandhi. It doesn't have an official name, but on my map it is shown as Bugu La, the Tibetan word La indicating it is a pass through the mountains. In his epic book The Snow Leopard, 1978, naturalist and travel writer Peter Matheson estimated the elevation at 16,900 feet. Here, in the northwest region of Nepal known as Upper Dolpo, the Tibetan plateau far below stretches as an endless series of barren mountains, a sight few people in history have ever seen. I'm on a mission to replicate Matheson's epic journey he took back in 1973. His trekking party had a group photo taken at the top of this very pass by colleague George Schaller, published in his book Stones of Silence, 1980, so I take one myself. Since I'm all alone atop Bugu La, in one of the most remote places in the world, there is no one shown in the photo. At one time, Upper Dolpo was a region of Tibet, until the warlike Nepalese Gurkhas marched in and took possession for themselves. The region, along with the nearby Tibetan culture of Mustang, still belongs to Nepal. cut off from the rest of the world by the Himalayas, Upper Dolpo and Mustang contain the last remnants of pure Tibetan culture left on the planet. Since there are no minerals or natural resources in Upper Dolpo, it is above the tree line, the region remains undisturbed. Our mission, led by a Tibetan monk, is to find and rescue abandoned children living in the world's highest inhabited villages, bring them to India where they can get an education, and eventually they will return to Upper Dolpo as teachers and doctors and save the last vestiges of their ancient Tibetan culture. Being as there is a civil war ongoing in Nepal at the time, and I've already been captured by the Maoist guerrillas and paid a ransom to be released, I am somewhat apprehensive about accidentally crossing the border into Tibet by mistake, there being no checkpoints or people or any living thing in this vast wilderness. Being captured by the Chinese army would be worse than being robbed by Nepalese Maoists. It seems that many people around the world have forgotten that Tibet was once a sovereign nation with its own long history, culture, and language. The People's Liberation Army of China's illegal and immoral invasion in 1959 led to years of murder that culminated in the complete overthrow of the Tibetan government and the self-imposed exile of the Dalai Lama to India, along with 100,000 Tibetans. According to a study undertaken by the University of Massachusetts, since the invasion, over 1 million Tibetans have been killed in Tibet. With the Chinese policy of resettlement of ethnic Chinese to Tibet, the Tibetans have become a minority in their own country. Chinese is now the official language. Compared to pre-1959. Chapter 14, Dubai is the Future. Among the rich, you'll never find a really generous man, even by accident. They may give their money away, but they will never give themselves away. They are egotistic, secretive, dry as old bones. To be smart enough to get all that money, you must be dull enough to want it. G.K. Chesterton, A Miscellany of Men. After I went to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates on a press trip, I titled my subsequent story, Dubai is the Future. Where once was nothing but sand, now there are gigantic skyscrapers. Dubai has the world's largest indoor shopping mall, world's highest building, world's largest indoor ski hill, world's largest man-made islands, and soon will have the world's largest airport. The local sheikhs have done nothing to deserve such vast wealth. They simply sit atop a vast sea of oil that Allah has kindly provided for them, obviously His chosen people. Foreigners come to work the oil fields, run the local businesses, and staff the hospitality industry. The sheikhs spend their ill-gotten wealth on fast cars, wild parties, and cleverly installing solar panels that will replace oil when it finally runs out. Why is Dubai the future? It needs to be understood that recent superpowers like the United States, Russia, Germany, and Great Britain are in decline for various reasons. The Brits no longer rule the waves, America is no longer the world's police officer, and Germany regrets being duped by Putin the poisoner into thinking the Russians were trustworthy. Coming in to partly replace these former powers are the Middle East oil kingdoms and, of course, China, which is rolling in dough thanks to its lopsided trade deal with the United States. The view from the observation deck on the 148th floor of the Burj Khalifa is mind-boggling. The Burj, at 2,716 feet, is the world's tallest building. Far below, looking like pinpricks, are the usual 40 to 50-story high-rise office towers. Offshore, contractors are building more and more man-made islands for sale to the richest people in the world. Invisible to the naked eye is the vast amount of money invested in Dubai and the Middle East by new Chinese investors. After coming home to Canada, I do some research. According to an investment website titled The First Group, Chinese investments in Dubai real estate hit $384 million U.S. in 2014, an annual increase of more than 300%, according to the Dubai Land Department, DLD. In the first 8 months of 2015, the figure had already reached $326 million. The Chinese were the 6th biggest foreign investors in Dubai after Indians, British, Iranians, Canadians, and Russians. The top 10 list also includes Americans, the French, and Afghanis. The rich, ultra-rich, and robber barons from other... Chapter 15, Out of Africa. When morality comes up against profit, it is seldom that profit loses. Shirley Chisholm. Africa is one of the few places in the world where I have never been. Friends who have lived there tell me the same Chinese invasion of money and people in Vancouver and many Western cities is happening there as well. I heard that the Chinese Communist Party was heavily investing in Africa, buying land and planting crops, building infrastructure, and digging great holes in the ground. This is true, say my business friends. In fact, China's not really investing. It's actually a system of concessional loans. Nearly all of China's programs in Africa contain a clause that stipulates all infrastructure-related programs are required to have 70% Chinese workers. The African governments can choose where the infrastructure is built, but they have to pay back the money in the form of natural resources, and are required to give employment to hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers instead of Africans. As part of Chinese investments, Africans are discovering that China is dumping its own cheap manufactured consumer goods on African markets, forcing small African businesses into bankruptcy, since they cannot afford to sell goods at the same prices. An estimated 750,000 Chinese have migrated to Africa over the past decade, and millions more are on their way. Nigeria, Angola, Ethiopia, and Sudan have received 70% of Chinese funds designated to Africa. That's because they have the raw resources that China wants. The Chinese Communist Party leaders are building roads to take raw minerals out of Africa. In exchange for building the infrastructure, they have negotiated under-market prices for Africa's oil, timber, coal, copper, and coltan. The Chinese government is deliberately creating segregated neighborhoods in Africa for Chinese people only. Chinatowns have sprung up throughout the continent. They're paying African workers very low salaries. Despite being able to get all the necessary timber for its internal market at home in China, the Chinese officials have signed contracts to get 70% of its timber imports from Africa. Chinese firms are not respecting conservation laws, wiping out whole forests throughout Gabon, Cameroon, Congo-Kinshasa, Equatorial Guinea, and Liberia. China is the #1 weapons supplier to Africa. From Ethiopia, Sudan, and Congo to Zimbabwe, Cameroon, or Gabon, China is selling African leaders weapons they can use against their own people. Countries like Zimbabwe or Sudan, where people are most affected by extreme poverty, have received the harshest loan conditions possible. The entire continent is being raped, and the world pays no attention. China, Africa's biggest foreign investor, has more at stake in Zimbabwe and more political influence than any other state. This is largely due to its extensive investments in the mining, agriculture, energy, and construction sectors. China was Zimbabwe. Chapter 16. The Killing Fields of Cambodia. A farm worker greets Joseph Stalin at his potato farm. "Comrade Stalin, we have so many potatoes that, piled one on top of the other, they would reach all the way to God," the farmer excitedly tells his leader. "But God does not exist," replies Stalin. "Exactly," says the farmer. "Neither do the potatoes." After pillaging Indochina of its rubber, tin, and other resources, and commencing a profitable heroin trade, the French left Cambodia to its own devices in the 1950s, leaving a small trail behind consisting of some Art Deco architecture, fine coffee, and tasty baguettes. I'm sitting on the patio of a cafe in the capital of Phnom Penh, near the Mekong River, enjoying a coffee and pastry, while ignoring a monk attempting to bully me into making a financial donation to his begging bowl. I'm also reading the Cambodia Daily newspaper and attempting to ascertain the future of this poor country, if such a thing is possible, while drinking a coffee and wondering what adventures I might enjoy while here on my latest trip to this destitute country. I have already revisited CCH, the Center for Children's Happiness, an orphanage on the outskirts of the city, where founder Mek Sokha runs a home for children rescued from Steong Minchi, the gigantic town dump. At CCH, I conspired to induce a rich Canadian friend to pay for the installation of internet service, and am therefore feeling smug with myself. Also, I've been hot on the trail of the infamous journalist Bernie Krischer, whom I met in San Francisco, and who has become something of a mentor to me in my attempts to learn and practice global micro-philanthropy on my trips to poor countries around the world. The name of Bernie Krischer strikes fear in the hearts of many. As a Jewish child, he escaped death during the Holocaust in Germany. As the American bureau chief for Newsweek in Asia during the Vietnam War, he met and interviewed presidents and emperors, building up a huge Rolodex of powerful contacts. He launched a tabloid that revolutionized Japanese media. In retirement, Bernie became a humanitarian, flouting international sanctions to bring rice to starving North Korea and pouring vast sums into war-ravaged Cambodia. Then he built hundreds of schools, founded an orphanage and a hospital, and started the Cambodia Daily. Krischer relentlessly pumped his connections for money and started project after project, from starting the schools to an initiative that paid families to educate their daughters. In 1993, Krischer started his English and Khmer language daily news out of an old hotel on the Mekong riverfront. He enticed a few expat Americans to run it, and they recruited Cambodian staffers who worked as fixers or translators. In a country where the local press was mostly corrupt or partisan, the paper, whose motto was "all the news without fear or favor," aimed to embody objective journalism and to train a generation of journalists. The Cambodian... Chapter 17. Claws of the Panda. For many decades, China's communist leaders have quietly followed a policy of soft power. They have carefully avoided actions or statements that would appear to be threatening to Western nations. Meanwhile, they've quietly inserted spies, followers, and business leaders into North American society, in particular Canada, where former leaders, such as Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, blindly and naively encouraged a growing relationship with the dragon. It's only very recently that the gloves have come off, and China shown its teeth to the world. Given how far ahead the Chinese plan, this move from soft power to harsh action was likely discussed and implemented years ago, and it is only when leaders like Xi Jinping feel perfectly ready to attack Western values that their behavior changed. Many would argue that the Chinese leaders are correct in their bold assessment. It is far too late in the game for the Western world to adapt. As its foreign policy, going ahead, China will do whatever it wants to do. It can easily afford to do so. The first expose of this switch from soft to hard power is shown in renowned journalist Jonathan Manthorpe's brilliant 2019 book, Claws of the Panda. As the book jacket notes explain, Canada has continued to misjudge the reality of the relationship, while the Chinese Communist Party has benefited from Canadian naivete. That's an understatement of the first order. Since 2019, the CCP has increased its bluster and issuing of threats and warnings to all Western nations. The synopsis on Amazon says, Claws of the Panda tells the story of Canada's failure to construct a workable policy towards the People's Republic of China. In particular, the book tells of Ottawa's failure to recognize and confront the efforts by the Chinese Communist Party to infiltrate and influence Canadian politics, academia, and media, and to exert control over Canadians of Chinese heritage. Claws of the Panda gives a detailed description of the CCP's campaign to embed agents of influence in Canadian business, politics, media, and academia. The party's aims are to be able to turn Canadian public policy to China's advantage, to acquire useful technology and intellectual property, to influence Canada's international diplomacy, and, most important, to be able to monitor and intimidate Chinese Canadians and others it considers dissidents. The book traces the evolution of the Canada-China relationship over nearly 150 years. It shows how Canadian leaders have constantly misjudged the reality and potential of the relationship, while the CCP and its agents have benefited from Canadian naivete. Blurbs from the back cover of the book go further. Hugh Segal, former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Canadian Senate, states, Claws of the Panda is a much-needed exposure of the CCP's step-by-step engagement through Canada and the world to advance its own economic, political, ideological, and... Chapter 18. Walmart and the Destruction of Small-Town America. In his travel narrative Deep South, instead of exploring Africa or the Far East, renowned American travel writer Paul Theroux spends part of several seasons touring the southern United States in his car, cruising through small towns ruined by offshoring of jobs to China. On page 48, he summarizes his discovery. There was hardly any work, he wrote. There were no visitors, as in years past. Once there had been textile factories making cloth and carpets. They'd closed. The manufacturing outsourced to China. There were some lumber mills, but they did not employ many people. It was the same all over the South, in the ruined towns that had been manufacturing centers, sustained by the making of furniture or appliances or roofing materials or plastic products, the labor-intensive jobs that kept a town ticking over. Companies had come to the South because the labor force was available and willing. Wages were low, land was inexpensive, and unions were non-existent. Nowhere else in the United States could manufacturing be carried out so cheaply. And that was the case, until these manufacturers discovered that, however cheap it was to make things in the right-to-work states of the South, it was even cheaper in sweatshop China. The contraction and impoverishment of the South had a great deal to do with the outsourcing of work to China and India. Even the catfish farms, an important income-producing industry all over the rural South, have been put out of business by the exports of fish farmers in Vietnam. Thoreau also detailed another reason why so many small towns had run to ruin. Walmart would build a regional store on the outskirts of town to avoid paying taxes. In time, this would cripple all the mom-and-pop stores in town, whether pharmacies, hardware, or sporting goods, whose owners would then be forced to work at Walmart for minimum wage. After destroying the town's economy, the Walmart itself might go out of business because no one had any money to shop at its superstore. Game over. The history of Walmart began in 1950, when businessman Sam Walton purchased a store from Luther E. Harrison in Bentonville, Arkansas, and opened Walton's Five and Dime. Yes, a little Five and Dime was the beginning of the mighty empire. The Walmart chain proper was founded in 1962 with a single store in Bentonville, expanding outside Arkansas by 1968, and throughout the rest of the southern United States by the 1980s, ultimately operating a store in every state of the United States, plus its first stores in Canada by 1995. By the second decade of the 21st century, the chain had grown to over 11,000 stores in 27 countries. Walton originally made the brilliant decision to achieve higher sales volumes by keeping sales prices lower than his competitors, often by reducing his profit margin. He understood that Americans like a good deal. In fact, for many consumers, price is the only consideration. Walmart has destroyed tens of thousands of small businesses and countless manufacturing jobs over the past few decades. It has become a gigantic operation that Chapter 19. Toronto the Big. Capitalism is against the things that we say we believe in. Democracy, freedom of choice, fairness. It's not about any of those things now. It's about protecting the wealthy. Michael Moore. The view from the top of the CN Tower in downtown Toronto is quite something, and well worth the long lineup to see it. But as a guest of the tourism board, I am given preferential treatment, and up I go with no waiting. I find the elevator is not quite as fast as Taipei 101 in Taiwan, or the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, but on a clear day from the top of the tower, you can see all across Lake Ontario. Plus, you get a bird's-eye view of the rest of Toronto downtown area, which has evolved into quite a sight. When I first came to Toronto in the late 1960s, Toronto the Good had a reputation for blandness. Growing up in Montreal in my day, nobody ever went to Toronto. Instead, Torontonians came to Montreal to party. You couldn't get a beer on Sundays in Toronto, and when the liquor store was open, you had to fill in papers to buy beer, and it was deliberately kept warm. In those days, the only good thing about Toronto was their hockey team. Not anymore. My first impression upon arriving and setting foot on a bustling sidewalk was that Toronto must be the most multicultural city in the world. I heard Spanish, Greek, Italian, and other accents I couldn't place. Foot traffic in TO moves twice the speed I normally walk. These are people on their way somewhere important. Lucky for me, I had reservations at the Chelsea Hotel, at 1,500 rooms, the largest hotel in Canada. From this central headquarters, I could walk anywhere, and I did. First, north to the Royal Ontario Museum. I found Yorkville, once a hippie hangout, is now fully upscale. A quick walk east to Church and Wellesley, a.k.a. the Gay Village, south down Yonge Street to Dundas Square to watch the street performers. The old Maple Leaf Gardens, now a Loblaws grocery store. The next day, a stroll around Old Town and the organized chaos that is St. Lawrence Market. Then the new Distillery District, brought back from the dead by cobblestones and ingenuity, people watching at its prime. I discovered that the baseball stadium, Sky Dome, hockey rink, entertainment district, CN Tower, bars and clubs, were also all within walking distance of my hotel. So were Chinatown, murals and restaurants, and the wonderful funky haze of outdoor Kensington Market, the Haight-Ashbury of Canada. Who said the 60s are dead? The Frank Gehry-designed Art Gallery of Ontario was hosting a Lauren Harris exhibition, all within ambling distance of my hotel. Little Portugal, Koreatown, Little Italy, Little India, Little Malta. I learned there are over 240 official and unofficial neighborhoods within the city's boundaries. The former city of small villages has finally morphed. Chapter 20, Taiwan and the Bear. The richest 1% of this country owns half our country's wealth, $5 trillion. You've got 90% of the American public out there with little or no net worth. Now, you're not naive enough to think we're living in a democracy, are you, buddy? It's the free market, and you're a part of it. Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed, in all of its forms, greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge in mankind. Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street. On my first trip to Taiwan years ago, courtesy Taiwan tourism, I went with a photographer who shall be called Brian, because he doesn't deserve the courtesy of having his full name mentioned. The agreement with Taiwan tourism was that I would write an article about Taiwan for Canadian newspapers. I did. In fact, I liked Taiwan so much I wrote and published several articles about Taiwan. The first titled, All of China in One Small Island. The title is self-explanatory. Brian, a professional photographer, took thousands of photos and shot loads of video footage, with the understanding that he would produce a documentary. He never did. There is so much to absorb in Taiwan. All of China could refer just to the food. There are 8 major cuisines in China: Anhui, Cantonese, Fujian, Hunan, Jiangsu, Shandong, Sichuan, and Zhejiang. They're all available in Taiwan. Should that not prove of interest, there is American-style Chinese food, like General Tso's chicken, egg rolls, wonton soup, fried rice, and sweet and sour dishes. In the bigger cities like Taipei and Taichung, you can find pizza, hamburgers, KFC, and other Western food. Taiwan is very cosmopolitan and sophisticated. We were in Hualien, in eastern Taiwan at the airport, waiting for a plane, when, out of boredom, Brian started to shoot photos of the jets, especially the Air Force planes. He was standing right next to a sign warning that the airport was also a military base, and that photos were strictly forbidden and subject to criminal penalties. Given that being arrested would cause severe embarrassment to Taiwan tourism, I pointed out the sign to Brian. "Who cares?" he said, snapping away. "What are they going to do? Arrest us?" Yes, I thought. The Taiwanese are very polite, and it's unlikely they will slap handcuffs on us, but perhaps we Canadians should also be polite and respect their regulations. Also, the Taiwanese stand on guard against an attack and invasion by the Chinese military and have every right to be concerned about security. At that time, I didn't know exactly how dangerous that military threat really was, but it came in sharp focus later on. Years later, on my fifth and final tour of the island, always courtesy of the courteous Taiwan Tourism Bureau, I hired a professional cinematographer named James. Please be sure to visit Amazon.com or Audible.com for more information on this book and the author. This has been Follow the Money, How China Bought the World, written by Michael William McCarthy, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2023 by Trina Day. Production copyright by Spoken Tome Media. You need to hear this.